All right. So the topic of our next session is a cloud without handcuffs, and what we're going to explore is the increasing risk that a small number of large technology companies have in locking in their customers and gaining substantial power over them over time. So with me are Joe Beda and Brandon Phillips, and it's very simple to introduce them. Joe invented Kubernetes.
Well,
one of the founders of Kubernetes, and Brandon is one of the founders of CoreOS. So I thought an interesting way to sort of frame the topic would be to kind of hear your stories about how you sort of got into doing what you're doing. And so Joe, I'll start with you. So how did Kubernetes come about?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me here. This is a great event. So Kubernetes came out of sort of a practical problem at Google as we were building out Google Cloud Platform and Google Compute Engine. Google had this system Borg that everybody used internally. A lot of folks have heard about that. And we faced this problem where we wanted to have Googlers and outside people using something very similar. So we either had to have Googlers start using raw VMs, or we had to bring Borg to the rest of the world. And we chose to bring Borg to the rest of the world, at least the Borg ideas to the rest of the world, and that's where Kubernetes came from. And we chose to do it as open source because, honestly, you play a different game when you're the underdog. And so open source really was a way for Google to get people to actually be interested in this stuff, start building on top of it when you're coming from a position with a large incumbent in the marketplace like Amazon. And so one of the original sort of motivations for Kubernetes from the get-go was to provide a certain level of application mobility that really sort of relates to the topic of the panel here.
Got it. So Brendan, CoreOS is in the business of applying open source technology, including Kubernetes, for customers. Talk a little bit about your mission and sort of what the opportunity that you saw and why you started the company.
Yeah, so when we started CoreOS about 4 years ago, the thing that we really were observing was twofold. First is that it was taking people forever in order to just get the basic infrastructure in place in order to deploy their applications. They were thinking about virtual machines. They were thinking about how you set up the infrastructure on these IaaSes. And it was just weeks and weeks of effort in order to go from some source code that ran on somebody's laptop to actually something running behind a load balancer. And so we spent a lot of time thinking about that problem, and containers was really the natural choice for that, which, to Joe's point, is the thing that essentially is allowing people to have mobility around their applications. Before, you were very much focused on virtual machines and configuring individual hosts, and now you can think about the application as something that is mobile between servers. So containers was super necessary to do what we wanted to do. And the other thing that we had in mind was that really the fundamental problem of a lot of this infrastructure is that people are only experts up to a certain layer. Generally, it's from wherever the source code they wrote and some of the libraries underneath it on up. And so we wanted to enable, through the use of containers, sort of a new security model for backend infrastructure, which is automated, and try to remove some of the toil of applying security updates to underlying infrastructure. So with those two things, we started to build a product portfolio now of like enterprise Kubernetes products and that sort of thing since the initial creation of the company.
And so we were talking before a little bit about sort of the loose committee in the case of Kubernetes that sort of decides what goes into the open source piece and what stays out of it. And it sort of brings up the larger topic of there are trade-offs, right, between using a container or an open source technology and kind of writing directly to a proprietary technology that either AWS or Google or Azure or others develop. How do you think about that? How, it could be from a customer or a user standpoint, or what goes into, what do you keep inside of the open source piece that's applicable to all, and at what point do you sort of trade off against something that's more proprietary?
Yeah, so I guess first is just like, what is Kubernetes providing? Kubernetes is providing a application-centric view of compute, network, and storage, and that's what we're trying to do. So the abstraction really is, how do we create a platform that allows people to consume compute, network, and storage but from an app-centric view, so they're able to move their application easily between compute, network, and storage. And so our abstractions really think about that first. And then the project, on top of those abstractions, tries to build useful integrations. So compute, network, and storage is useful on its own, but you actually need load balancers or object store, service discovery. And so it's really about that initial abstraction, that portability abstraction is the core of the product or the project of Kubernetes.
So I think one comparison that folks have made, and it's an inexact analogy, but I think it's useful, is Kubernetes is somewhat of a kernel for distributed systems. And when you think about Linux, there's really two parts to Linux. There's the actual kernel that runs on everything from a cell phone all the way up to a mainframe, and then there's the user mode components that actually wrap around that. And so when we think about sort of what is Kubernetes and what isn't, I think there's a general feeling that we want to keep Kubernetes as that kernel that is actually really flexible about being able to work in lots of different situations, but recognizing that you're going to have to build integrations, you're going to have to build systems, you're going to have that user mode on top of it to really make it work. Now, again, there's places where this analogy breaks down, but I think in this context, it's pretty useful.
And Hadi, you've talked about different layers or levels of lock-in, whether you're sort of in the operational level or the developer level, and how to think about that, and also the risks. Can you speak more about that a little bit?
Yeah, so the advice that I've given folks is that any sort of vendor lock-in is fundamentally unavoidable. Like as soon as you write your first line of code, you're making assumptions. The real question here is one of what is the risk with that lock-in? And you can measure that by what is it going to take in terms of effort to actually make a change. And you have to weigh that risk of having to make that change, the amount of effort, versus the benefits that you get. For certain companies where, if you're a startup and you're just worrying about, being in business next week, you're not worried about the risk of having to move away from a public cloud vendor. If you're a very large company and you see the cloud vendor as a peer versus as some immovable sort of big giant, then that changes your relationship, and your risk profile there changes pretty dramatically also. And so one of the ways that I think it's useful to break this down is that there's certain types of lock-in where if you were going to make a change, it's a problem for the operations team. And so maybe now it's a 2-week project, a 1-month project, depending on how fast your organization moves, versus whether it's a project for the development team, which means that now I have to go ahead and rewrite my application because I want to move off of one platform to another. And I think in general, Kubernetes at least tends to move those problems to be more of operational lock-in problems versus development lock-in problems.
Joe, Brandon, what do you think about that?
So I think just to get concrete around that, some of the ways that it makes it more of an operational problem is that by using Kubernetes, people are able to easily do things like, I want to just bring up a dev environment. I don't necessarily have to go talk to the cloud provider in order to get my dev environment set up. I want to try testing this on some sort of internal infrastructure that's in our office. I don't necessarily have to bring up another environment. So that's like one area where Kubernetes is already starting to provide some value, is that you can start to utilize the compute, network, and storage and have abstractions that allow you some initial portability. Now, the application side, it's really about APIs that you can consume, and whether those APIs are something you can get from anybody else. So in the case of the cloud providers, they're doing a lot of these things where it's like, we build a database that's tied to our data center. So it's like DynamoDB you can get from our data center only. And that's where the real risk comes in. And it's not a problem that Kubernetes is tackling yet, but it's a problem that you're starting to see some people build portable databases on top of Kubernetes. Example being like CockroachDB, where they're building a horizontally scalable database that runs on top of Kubernetes. And so anywhere that Kubernetes runs, which is nearly everywhere you can get compute, network, and storage, you now have a competitor to this database that you used to only be able to get from these particular data centers. And so that abstraction allows for your application developers to consume what they want, but be free from that kind of data center or cloud lot.
Yeah, I mean, it's a chicken and egg. How does that work over time, too, right? Because you can say, yes, startups need to get there quickly, but once you start down that road, sort of, how do you come off of it? And then larger companies have larger spend, so they're more incentivized to get off at that point in time, but then it's more difficult. So it's a recurring problem that's happened over the last 30 or 40 years in technology, right? So how do you play that out, and where does it end up?
I mean, for a lot of these organizations, it just comes down to cost-benefit analysis. Started to go down that road with a number of companies where they simply look at their application code, figure out how much they're locked into it, and make a year-long effort in order to try to get this application running on another cloud. And that's simply where they're at, because they need, in a lot of cases, they need the leverage for business reasons. They're spending 7, 8 figures on their cloud bill. You better have some leverage, and that leverage only comes when you can actually make and call a bluff of we're going to move to another cloud. And so it's just, at this point, it's a business decision, because these companies have built directly against the cloud providers, to the point of even the compute. They can't even create a server organizationally for their application without talking to the cloud providers. So it's a bit of an effort to start from that spot.
I think it's a new type of technical debt.
Yep.
And like every other type of technical debt, it feels real good when you start out. Everything's super easy, and it compounds on you. So
Yep.
there's no one answer there, because there are times when taking on that debt makes sense.
Do you think this will sort of keep? I think I read somewhere recently that the salaries of mainframe programmers are going up now, because even though the demand for mainframes continues to go down, the number of people that are able to do it is going down more significantly, because new people aren't sort of incentivized to do that. Do you think this probably just plays out again, you think, in the same way that Oracle sort of evolved and happened in the case of mainframes?
I think it's clear, I don't know over what timeline that's actually going to play out. I think there is an analogy to be made between the big public clouds and the legacy mainframe vendors, and sort of the amount of vendor lock-in that folks saw there. I think what it does tell you is that, AWS as a business is not going to go away anytime soon. Even if it's no longer the preferred choice at some point in the future, they're going to have a very long tail. That money fire hose is not going to shut off anytime soon. I mean, just like Microsoft Windows, right? It's like it's here with us to stay, even if the world moves on. And I think the public clouds are going to be like that also.
And how much awareness are you both seeing of this topic in general? I mean, I think it's written about. I think in small communities, it's talked about quite a bit. How does that compare to sort of the overall market awareness?
I feel like it's a lot of these companies, and it's going to be the larger ones that are one way or the other competing against the major technology companies that run clouds. So it is like the Fortune, probably 1,500. But at this point, I don't think there's clear articulation that it's a problem yet. I think they feel it. We haven't figured out the word. Is it cloud debt? Is it cloud technical debt? What the word is, and I think it's very much a nascent topic, but it's a nascent topic that's becoming more and more important to these companies. They're shutting down their data centers, and now they realize that they moved all their applications to data centers that they can't shut down, because if they shut it down, their revenue-generating apps go away. So this is a new, interesting challenge for the CIOs of these companies to figure out.
And people talk about data gravity, right? Like you've seen the Amazon semi-truck. Well, that truck makes one-way trips, right? And so I think, once you realize that, you're like, oh, we have to game this out. We have to start thinking about it. But again, I don't think it's something that is, on sort of the standard checklist that CIOs are looking at quite yet. Like Brendan said, when you have a 7 or 8 figure bill, though, you definitely have to take that vendor very seriously and understand how that impacts your business long term.
Yeah. You started the conversation about talking about how Kubernetes developed and talking about Amazon, and a lot of this is about Amazon. I think, or part of this is about Amazon. Are they? Well, it looks like you're going to jump in, so you can jump in. But I was going to. You should jump in, and then are the different sort of large vendors approaching this differently, either because of their market position or otherwise?
I think Amazon definitely is the big elephant in this space for sure. I do think that this goes beyond Amazon. I think that when you look at Kubernetes and containers, it provides a programming model and an abstraction that did not exist for Amazon. And I think Amazon has been struggling to actually find this sort of middle layer of both infrastructure, yet also easier to use, easier to deploy. And so the things that are making this sort of layer of infrastructure so interesting is not just this, cloud, multi-cloud strategy, app mobility, but it's also a fundamentally different sort of way of thinking about controlling, automating, programming applications. So I think it's that double whammy that's actually made things super interesting. And I think many vendors are approaching this from just the sort of how do we compete with the public clouds point of view, but I think the most interesting stuff is really about how do we actually utilize this new tool set to do things that we weren't able to do before.
Do you want to add to that, Brendan? You work with a lot of different both technologies and vendors with your customers.
Yeah, I mean, at this stage, particularly around the Lockin story, it's simply about making and ensuring this technology works consistently across the board. So like when Kubernetes came out, it was a great product that had this potential for moving cloud lock-in, but the technology wasn't there to actually run it on Amazon. So like one of our first challenges at CoreOS was to make it possible for people to get the value of Kubernetes on Amazon. So we had to build some new technology around networking, et cetera. We got it up and running. So it's going to be an ongoing technological kind of battle. And the cloud providers will continue to come out with new innovations around authentication. Google released new silicon that provides all these new security primitives directly to your applications, running on their clouds only, of course. And so it's going to be a battle constantly as we figure out the abstractions that we can bring across all the boards, and then the cloud providers actually being large innovators themselves, not just in the infrastructure space. You're seeing it in the data storage areas, the networking areas, bringing their own POPs, et cetera.
Yeah. What's the counter to, because I've heard, especially actually specifically for CoreOS, like what's the counter to, yeah, sure, CoreOS is going to help me not get locked into Amazon or Google, but then I'm going to be locked into CoreOS or dependent on their services and their people as they help me implement these things. Yeah.
So essentially, what our customers are getting from us is they're getting Kubernetes API. So they're coding against an API that they will be able to run themselves, and it's kind of a new way of thinking about open source business models. So we're giving them an API that we don't modify. We provide them upstream Kubernetes. Now, what is the service we're providing them? Today, what we're providing them is a bunch of integrations. So we take open source software like Prometheus and integrate that into Kubernetes, and that integration is something that they can then hook up to their own apps. And so it's really about taking all these pieces and providing a cohesive experience that is not just infrastructure, but also application monitoring and the life cycle of those applications, et cetera. And then what I don't think really anyone thinks about, but a lot of the value of cloud is that they automate the operations of these really hard things. And so we provide you with open source software that's automated. So your monitoring stuff, we provide updates to the monitoring software. If there's a security vulnerability in the TLS handling of your monitoring software, you want an update for that. There's a security vulnerability in Kubernetes, you need an update for that. So providing that full stack, which is an ongoing service. And we don't really even think about that value proposition of the cloud, but your software vendors have to start providing this value proposition of like zero toil automation around resecuring the infrastructure when a new vulnerability appears in the wild.
So we have time for about 2 or 3 questions from the audience, if anyone has anything they want to ask for our panelists.
Right behind the pillar.
I have a quick question about whether or not cloud lock-in is really the driver for enterprises looking to deploy multi-cloud and how you enable that. So for example, customers who have really critical applications, let's say Visa and their transaction network, usually avail themselves of multiple networks for high availability reasons and things like that. Do you see that that's really more the value proposition versus this cloud lock-in argument that is bantered around quite a bit?
Yeah, so we have seen essentially both. with our customers. Some have a sort of CIO down mandate that they have a multi-cloud story so that they have the negotiation leverage. Others have done it for business continuity, to your point. And it really depends on essentially their internal risk assessment. I think both are important, and both end up with the same end result. You need an API that avoids cloud lock-in, because if you can have all this like beautiful architecture astronaut diagrams of how your business will survive the great Amazon explosion, but if you don't actually get your applications running, it's kind of all pointless. And so implementing that reality is where a lot of people are at.
I think there's another angle to this, which is geography. I mean, as applications become more local, as people want to say, I want to deploy my app within 15 milliseconds of 95% of my target population. It's oftentimes not possible to do that with a single cloud vendor. And so having some sort of substrate that you can actually write your application against that is flexible across all those different environments becomes a really powerful business accelerator.
Yeah, I think it'll be interesting as we continue to see the global distribution of compute, network, and storage, and then different business models emerge. You'll start to have all these like cost-benefit analyses that you can make of, do I care about this local POP? Do I actually care about total cost of ownership of renting that compute, network, and storage? I think there'll be a lot of competition, particularly outside of Americas and EMEA, around building out data centers that have all these different trade-offs in mind. So.
I suspect this is something that Cloudflare thinks about a lot.
Who else? Anyone going once, going twice? All right, we're going to take an hour break now for lunch. We'll be back with our next session at 1 p.m. And lunch is on the roof in the basement, and there's also a side patio over here for everybody. So we'll be back at 1 o'clock. I want to thank both Joe and Brandon for a great discussion. Thank you.